At 61, I bought myself a little house. It wasn't out of spite. It wasn't a luxury. I did it because I finally wanted to breathe easy again. But the moment my daughter-in-law Chloe found out, she suddenly decided she had a right to it. To my money, to my keys, to my life. That was the exact moment I knew this time I wasn't backing down. You don't buy a house on a whim. It's something you build up to after years of thinking. At 61, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my hard-earned savings, and I didn't need anyone's permission. For the past 2 years, my son Austin and Chloe had been living in the upstairs apartment of my duplex, and the walls were closing in on me. Chloe was slowly taking over our daily lives, rearranging my kitchen, criticizing my routines, and treating me like an uninvited guest in my own home. Instead of getting into screaming matches, I walked into the bank, signed the paperwork for a cozy little townhouse on the edge of town, and kept the whole thing to myself. Austin had always been passive, the kind of guy who'd rather swallow his tongue than start a fight with his wife. Chloe, on the other hand, thought she ran the world, and I'm sure she already viewed my savings account as the down payment for her own grand plans. As moving day crept closer, I started packing boxes late at night while the two of them were upstairs watching TV. It wasn't about being a coward. It was pure survival strategy to avoid endless arguments about my finances. But the second Chloe stumbled across a brochure for the new townhouse on my kitchen table, the atmosphere in the house shifted instantly. Her eyes narrowed into slits, and she demanded to know why I had spent family money without consulting them. Austin just stood there, true to form, staring at his shoes without uttering a single word in my defense or his own. Chloe went on a tirade calling me selfish and accusing me of sabotaging the family's future instead of helping them out financially. I stayed completely calm, took a slow sip of my coffee, and told her flat out that it was my money, my sweat, and my decision. My lack of drama only made her angrier. She was clearly fishing for a blowout fight or a tearful apology. She slammed the kitchen door so hard, the frames rattled while Austin gave me a pathetic, apologetic look before shuffling out. Right then, I knew that packing up and leaving was the only way to keep my sanity. That little townhouse wasn't an indulgence. It was my lifeboat, a peaceful sanctuary for my retirement away from her constant power trips. The news of my new house spread through Chloe's mind like wildfire, twisting her initial anger into pure, unadulterated greed. By the very next evening, she was sitting at my dining table, this time, wielding a literal checklist of demands disguised as family collaboration. She coolly explained that my new townhouse was actually the perfect size for her and Austin, and that I should just stay put in the upstairs apartment. When I just stared at her in silence, she went a step further, demanding that her name be put on the deed for financial security. Austin gave a weak, pressured nod, completely blind to how absurd the situation was and entirely incapable of standing up to her. Chloe actually argued that a spacious townhouse was a total waste on an older single woman and that they could utilize the space so much better. I realized right then that she had mistaken my kindness for weakness all these years, and it was time to draw a hard line in the sand. I pulled the keys to the new house out of my pocket, laid them on the table, covered them firmly with my hand, and looked her dead in the eye. This house is mine and mine alone, Chloe, and no one else's name is going on that deed, I said, my voice steady and completely unbothered. Chloe's face turned bright red, and she started spitting insults, calling me cold and cheap, preaching about how family is supposed to look out for each other. She even had the nerve to suggest that if I absolutely insisted on living there, I could always convert the garage into a mother-in-law suite for myself. That level of audacity didn't even hurt my feelings. It just validated everything I already suspected about her true character. I stood up, cleared my dishes into the dishwasher, and walked away from the conversation, leaving her talking to an empty room. Austin tried to sneak downstairs later to apologize to me in private, but I told him straight up that words without backbone are completely worthless. The battle lines were officially drawn, and I knew I had to watch my back from here on out. Over the next few days, Chloe tried to break my spirit and sabotage my move through constant petty passive aggression. She completely rearranged the shared living spaces, banished my personal belongings to the basement, and took over the grocery shopping without asking. Whenever I walked into the kitchen, she'd conveniently block the stove or look right through me like I was a ghost, trying to freeze me out. Austin went into total hiding during these mind games, spending every free second working late or burying himself in garage projects. I didn't cry and I didn't complain. I just took notes and hit her right back where it hurt her wallet. First, I cut off all financial contributions to the household expenses and started buying groceries exclusively for myself. I bought a mini fridge for my bedroom and locked my food away to nip any kitchen confrontation in the bud. Chloe realized pretty quickly that the cash for her high-end grocery hauls had dried up, and she cornered me furious about the missing rent and utility money. I just looked at her and said, "Every dollar I have is going toward my new house now. You two are on your own." Her grand plan to bully me into submission crashed and burned against my emotional wall and total financial detachment. Dinner times became exercises in icy silence, broken only by Chloe making loud, toxic remarks about ungrateful parents to the walls. I refused to take the bait, opting to read my Kindle and enjoy the peace that my own stubbornness provided. Austin sat between us like a prisoner of war, terrified to lean one way or the other. It became crystal clear to me that I wasn't just defending a piece of real estate. I was fighting for the independence I had spent a lifetime building. Behind the scenes, my moving preparations continued like clockwork, quiet, precise, and completely unstoppable. You don't leave a new house unprotected, especially when your own family members are eyeing it like a prize. Before a single piece of furniture even touched the floors, I hired a locksmith to replace every single lock on the townhouse with high-security deadbolts. I knew Chloe would try to manipulate Austin into getting a spare key, just to force her way in and create a permanent presence. The locksmiths got the job done quickly, and when those heavy, solid keys were placed in my hand, a massive wave of relief washed over me. Chloe had no idea that her grand designs were about to hit a literal steel wall. That weekend, she told Austin they were driving over to the new townhouse to help measure the rooms for furniture. She completely took for granted that I'd hand over the keys just to keep the peace and play nice. When she confronted me about it in the entryway, I just shook my head and slipped the keychain deep into my purse. "There's nothing to measure, Chloe. The house is done, and I'm moving in alone," I said, calm as a Tuesday. Chloe practically self-decapitated, with rage stomping her foot and screaming that I had zero trust in my own flesh and blood. Austin stood in the background, visibly mortified by his wife's hysterical meltdown, but he did absolutely nothing to pull her back. Chloe shrieked that I was a selfish old woman who was tearing this family apart just to get my way. Without saying a word, I turned on my heel, walked into my bedroom, and clicked the lock shut behind me to end the drama. I could hear her screaming and pacing outside for a long time, until Austin finally convinced her to leave the house to blow off steam. That blowout proved to me once and for all that soft words were useless against her. Only hard, unyielding facts worked. Facts. Moving day was gray, chilly, and pouring rain a perfect match for the suffocating tension that had hung over the house for weeks. I had hired a small team of professional movers instead of asking Austin for help because I refused to owe them a single favor. The guys were incredibly efficient loading my boxes onto the truck, while Chloe stood at the upstairs window with her arms crossed, watching my every move like a hawk. She had been praying I'd fall flat on my face without her, but my logistics had been airtight from day one. Austin did end up helping carry my heavy sectional sofa down the stairs, but only because Chloe had stepped into the bathroom for a few minutes and couldn't see him. Once the truck was fully loaded, I walked through the rooms that had been my home for years one last time. Chloe intercepted me in the hallway, blocking my path and holding out an open palm like a toll collector. "Since you're leaving, the least you can do is leave your keys to the downstairs unit so we can start remodeling," she demanded coldly. I looked at her, pulled out my key ring, unclipped the old house key, and dropped it onto the entryway table. "I still own half of this duplex, Chloe. Don't you ever forget that," I reminded her, my voice quiet but freezing. The triumphant smirk vanished from her face the second she realized she still didn't have full ownership of the property. Austin walked up, shook my hand, and quietly wished me the best of luck with my fresh start. I squeezed his hand, feeling the genuine regret rolling off him, but I knew he had to sleep in the bed he made with Chloe. I climbed into my car, didn't look back in the rearview mirror once, and drove toward my new life on the edge of town. That first night in the townhouse was unbelievably quiet, no stomping over my head, and no toxic energy vibrating through the walls. The first few weeks in my new place flew by in a blur of hanging curtains, unboxing memories, and arranging furniture exactly how I wanted it. It was pure bliss to leave the kitchen at night and find it the exact same way the next morning without someone upending my space. Nobody critiqued what I bought, nobody complained about what I watched on TV, and the silence was like medicine for my soul. I barely heard from Austin during that time, just the occasional late-night text asking how I was doing. I kept my replies short and sweet, never prying and never asking about Chloe or what they were up to. My life regained a beautiful routine. I tended to my small patio garden and finally dug out my old painting supplies. But the peace was a bit of an illusion because Chloe wasn't the type of woman to take a loss lying you down. Through a neighbor back at the old duplex, I found out that the two of them were trying to list the downstairs unit as an expensive rental to bring in some serious cash. But because the property was legally tied up in a family trust, they couldn't rent out a single square foot without my written consent. I played it cool and waited for them to come to me knowing their entire plan was legally worthless without my signature. It didn't take long for the phone to ring. Austin's voice was uncharacteristically sweet, asking if we could get together. I knew immediately that Chloe was pulling the strings, using her husband as a glorified messenger boy to do her dirty work. I agreed to meet up, but I picked a bustling coffee shop downtown, keeping my new home strictly off limits as my personal fortress. The next round of the game was starting, but this time, I held all the cards, and I was more than ready. The cafe was packed with the morning rush, which gave me a sense of security since Chloe usually pretended to have manners when the public was watching. They were already waiting for me at a corner table by the window, and Chloe flashed me a smile so sugary it made my skin crawl. Austin looked like a nervous wreck, aggressively stirring his coffee and constantly glancing at his wife for silent cues. After a few minutes of hollow small talk, Chloe cut right to the chase and slid a document across the table toward me. It was a power of attorney form, given them total authority to rent out the duplex, written up to look like they were doing me a favor. She eagerly explained that the rental income would go toward putting a brand new roof on the duplex, which would protect our joint investment. I read through every line of the paperwork, slowly laid it back on the table, and slid it right back into her space. I'm not signing this, Chloe. In fact, I'm selling my half of the duplex to a real estate investor, I said, completely unbothered. Chloe's fake smile froze instantly, and Austin practically choked on his coffee, completely blindsided by the plot twist. She had expected me to be intimidated or guilted into compliance, but she never anticipated a cutthroat business move. "You can't do that. That's our home," Chloe hissed, totally losing her grip on her temper and drawing stares from the tables around us. I calmly explained that the investor had already made a very generous cash offer and that I needed to liquidate my equity to pay off my new townhouse. Austin just stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, finally realizing that his years of being a doormat were having real, devastating consequences on his life. The conversation was over. I dropped a $5 bill on the table, for my coffee stood up, and walked out into the fresh air. My decision to sell my stake in the duplex sent Chloe into an absolute tailspin, because a third-party investor meant her total control over the property was dead in the water. 2 days after our cafe showdown, she showed up completely unannounced at my townhouse, leaning on my doorbell like it was an emergency. I looked through the peephole, took a deep breath, and opened the door only as far as the heavy security chain would allow. Her face was contorted with pure rage. The masks were entirely off, and she jammed her foot into the door jamb to keep me from closing it. She started screaming at me, demanding to be let in to talk like civilized adults, while throwing every insult in the book at me. "You are destroying your own son's life just to satisfy your sick, stubborn pride," she shrieked through the crack in the door. I stood firmly behind the wood, gripping the handle tight, completely immune to her emotional blackmail. "Chloe, remove your foot from my door right now, or I am calling the police and letting the neighbors film this entire meltdown," I said, my voice ice cold. That threat worked like a charm. Her entire identity was built on looking perfect to the outside world, and the thought of a public scene terrified her. She snapped her foot back, shook her fists at me, and swore that if I went through with the sale, I would never see Austin again. I shut the door, locked every deadbolt, and sat down in my living room with a book while her car violently peeled out of my driveway. Austin called me later that night, completely breaking down in tears, begging me not to sell, because Chloe was making his life an absolute living hell. It broke my heart to hear my son reduced to something so broken and weak, but I knew that giving in would only prolong his misery. I told him that my door was always open to him, but only him, and only if he left his manipulative wife behind. The pressure on the two of them mounted by the day as the investor's real estate agents began scheduling walkthroughs and home inspections of the duplex. Chloe finally realized that her tantrums and emotional warfare were bouncing right off me, and legally, she didn't have a leg to stand on. Eventually, Austin came to see me all by himself. He looked 10 years older, completely drained by the nonstop warfare of the last few weeks. We sat in my new kitchen, and he finally admitted that he couldn't take it anymore. Chloe had threatened to divorce him if they lost the house, which had finally opened his eyes to what she really cared about the property on him. He didn't beg me to stop the sale this time. Instead, he looked at me with exhaustion and asked what my terms were for a peaceful resolution. I respected his newfound honesty, so I offered him a fair way out, one that secured his future, but completely broke Chloe's grip. I told him I was willing to sign my half of the duplex over to him as a gift on one strict condition: he had to be listed as the sole individual owner on the deed. Chloe was to have zero legal rights to the property, completely blocking her from leveraging it or trying to take over again. Austin didn't hesitate for a second. He signed the preliminary paperwork at the real estate lawyer's office the next morning, showing a real backbone for the first time in his adult life. When Chloe found out about the arrangement, she went on a legendary rampage for days, but she ultimately had to accept that she had lost the game. Her grand scheme to get rich off my hard work and exile me to a garage had collapsed under the weight of my boundaries. Austin kept his home, but more importantly, he finally learned that you have to stand up for yourself, no matter how hard the wind blows. A few months later, the final paperwork was recorded at the county office, and the new reality settled in permanently. Austin still lives in the duplex, but the entire power dynamic of his marriage shifted completely the moment he became the sole homeowner. Chloe has become noticeably quieter and more subdued. She knows exactly what she stands to lose if she steps out of line again. My relationship with Austin is a bit more distant than it used to be, but it's finally built on mutual respect rather than silent, suffocating codependency. He comes over to visit me once a month by himself. We drink coffee on the patio, talk about the garden, and leave the ghosts of the past exactly where they belong. Chloe has never set foot near my townhouse, and I have absolutely zero interest in any fake plastic reconciliations with her. This little house is my absolute pride and joy, a living symbol of my ability to protect myself and hold my ground when the world gets ugly. When I sit out on my deck in the evenings and watch the sunset, a deep, unbreakable peace settles into my chest. I prove to myself that you don't need to scream or play dirty games to protect your life and your future. Clear boundaries, decisive actions, and a cool head are infinitely more powerful than any emotional tyranny Chloe could ever throw at me. I don't regret a single choice I made, even if the road was painful and cost me a few illusions about my family. Sometimes you have to tear down the old structures and build high walls just to create a peaceful, solid foundation for the rest of your life. I closed my patio door, turned the heavy deadbolt, and smiled at the beautiful, completely independent silence of my own home. A home that no one can ever take away from me.